The morning light in Ohio was pale and cold, sliding through the half-open blinds of a weathered little house that had seen decades of laughter, arguments, birthdays, and prayers. Inside sat Margaret and William Dawson, a couple in their late 70s whose hands had grown thin but whose hearts were still filled with the warmth of years spent together. Their house had once been filled with the noise of a young boy named Ethan, shoes clattering on wooden floors, his laughter bouncing down the hallway, the smell of his favorite chocolate chip pancakes floating through the air on Saturday mornings. But those sounds were long gone now, replaced by the quiet tick of an old wall clock and the hum of a tired refrigerator. Ethan had grown up restless, always reaching for something bigger, better, louder than the life his parents had built for him. He'd been a bright child, top of his class, captain of the debate team, admired by teachers, and Margaret and William had poured every ounce of love, every penny of their modest savings, into making sure he could follow his dreams.
When he earned a scholarship to New York University, they cried tears of pride and fear all at once. On the day he left,
Margaret packed his favorite sandwiches, and William slipped a folded $20 bill into his hand, saying, "For the days when the world feels heavier than you expected." Ethan smiled, hugged them quickly, and promised he'd call every week. But in the months that followed, those calls became shorter, then rarer, until eventually the phone fell silent. In New York, Ethan found what he thought was success: a sleek apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows, an expensive watch, and a job in marketing that kept him working late into the night. He told himself he was too busy to visit home, too focused to answer every message. He sent flowers on his parents' anniversaries and wired money for holidays, but never came back in person. When friends asked about his family, he'd shrug, saying, "They're fine," as if fine were enough. Meanwhile, in Ohio, Margaret still cooked enough dinner for 3, and William still looked out the window whenever a car slowed near the house, hoping it might be their boy. They told neighbors, "Ethan's doing great." In the city, their voices soft with pride and sadness tangled together. Life moved on like that for years, quiet, patient, and heavy with waiting. Then one winter morning, when the snow outside lay thick and white like a blanket, William collapsed while shoveling the front steps. The thud of the shovel hitting the ground echoed through the still air.
And Margaret came running, calling his name. Her hands trembled as she called 911. Then another number she hadn't dialed in months: Ethan's. Her voice was thin, breaking between sobs. "It's your father. He's had a heart attack."
3 hours later, in a corner office overlooking Times Square, Ethan froze mid-sentence during a presentation as his phone buzzed with her voicemail. When he heard her words, a strange tightness gripped his chest: guilt, fear, and something else he couldn't name. Without thinking, he told his assistant to cancel his meetings, packed a bag, and caught the first flight to Ohio. The drive from the airport felt like a journey through memory. The same cracked highway signs, the same diners his parents used to take him to after Little League games, the same church steeple rising over the town square. But everything felt smaller now, smaller and sadder. When he reached the hospital, Margaret was sitting alone in the waiting room, her hands clasped in prayer. Her hair, once chestnut brown,
was silver now, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion. When she saw him, she didn't scold him for being gone so long. She simply whispered,
"You came." Those 2 words carried the weight of all the years he'd missed, all the dinners left uneaten, all the birthdays forgotten. Ethan knelt beside her and took her hands, feeling the fragile bones beneath her skin. "How is he?" he asked, his voice barely steady. "He's sleeping," she said. "He asked for you." Inside the room, the rhythmic beeping of machines filled the silence. William looked smaller than Ethan remembered, his skin pale, tubes running from his arms. For a long time, Ethan couldn't speak. He just sat there, staring at the man who had once lifted him onto his shoulders to see fireworks, who had taught him how to ride a bike, who had stayed up nights helping him study for exams. "Dad," he whispered finally. "I'm sorry." William opened his eyes slowly, a weak smile spreading across his face. "You look tired, son," he murmured, his voice raspy but warm. "City not feeding you well?" Ethan let out a choked laugh. "Not really," he said, and for a moment, they both laughed through tears, and it felt like the years between them disappeared. He stayed that night in the hospital. Margaret dozed in a chair beside William's bed while Ethan watched the monitors blink and thought about all the moments he had traded for meetings, deadlines, and money. When dawn came, light spilled across the room like forgiveness. Over the next few days, William's condition improved slowly, and Ethan became a familiar sight in the hospital cafeteria, bringing soup for his mother, reading the newspaper to his father, rediscovering the rhythm of their lives. After a week, when William was finally discharged, Ethan drove them home, his hands tight on the steering wheel. The house looked smaller, to paint peeling on the porch. The mailbox rusted, but inside, it still smelled faintly of cinnamon and warmth. In his old bedroom, the trophies were still on the shelf, and the framed photo of his high school graduation stood exactly where his mother had left it, dusty but cherished. That night, while his parents slept, Ethan wandered the hallway, touching the pictures on the wall: his first bike, his high school prom, his parents' wedding day. The weight of regret settled on him like a heavy blanket. He found Margaret awake in the kitchen, knitting by the soft glow of a lamp. "Mom," he said quietly, "I wasn't a good son." She looked up, her eyes gentle, the way they had always been. "Ethan," she said softly, "you were our boy. We just waited for you to come home." He canceled his flight back to New York the next morning. He called his office and told them he'd be taking a leave of absence. The city felt far away now, its noise, its pressure, its endless climb. He started working remotely, helping local businesses with marketing. He fixed the creaking porch with his father, helped his mother plant tulips in the front yard, and rediscovered the joy of slow mornings and shared dinners. They laughed together again, real laughter that came from the belly, not the polite kind exchanged over phone calls. He took his parents for drives through the countryside,
stopping at old diners they used to visit when he was a boy. Every small thing felt sacred: the sound of his father's voice telling a story, his mother's hand resting on his arm as she said grace before
dinner. But one evening, temptation came calling again. His inbox pinged with an email from a major marketing firm in Los Angeles, offering him double his salary, a penthouse apartment, and prestige beyond what he'd ever had. For a few minutes, he sat in silence, staring at the glowing screen. His heart thudded with old ambition. But then his gaze shifted to the living room where his parents sat together, heads leaning against each other, the TV flickering softly. He thought of his father's frail smile, his mother's trembling hands, the hospital, the forgiveness in her voice when she said, "You came." He closed the laptop and went outside into the cool night air. The stars stretched endlessly above him, and for the first time in years, he felt that he was exactly where he belonged. Weeks turned into months. Ethan built a small marketing agency in town, hiring local graduates and teaching them everything he'd learned in the city. He became something of a local hero, not for his success, but for his humility. He sponsored community events, helped neighbors fix their websites, and treated everyone with the kindness he'd once neglected to give his own parents. Life slowed down but grew fuller. He learned to cook with his mother, took long walks with his father, and rediscovered the rhythm of family life he had thrown away. He realized that true success wasn't measured in promotions or titles, but in laughter shared across the dinner table, and the peace that came from knowing he was finally doing right by the people who had loved him first. Time, however, doesn't pause for second chances forever. One autumn morning, William didn't wake up. The house was quiet except for the rustle of leaves outside. Ethan found him still, peaceful, a faint smile on his lips as though he were dreaming of a younger day. The grief that hit Ethan was unlike anything he'd ever felt, a deep, aching sorrow laced with gratitude. He sat beside his father's bed, holding his hand long after the warmth had faded, whispering, "Thank you, Dad, for waiting for me." The funeral was small, just close friends and neighbors. Margaret stood beside Ethan, tears streaming silently. And when it was over, they went home together, the silence between
them full of shared love and loss. After that, Ethan devoted himself to caring for his mother. He took over chores his father used to do, fixing the gate, paying the bills, mowing the lawn.
Margaret grew frailer with each passing year, but her smile remained bright whenever Ethan entered the room. He read to her from her favorite books, drove her to Sunday church, and listened to her hum the same lullabies she used to sing when he was a child. Sometimes she would reach out and touch his face, whispering, "You've changed, Ethan," and he would smile and answer, "I just came home, Mom." Then, one spring evening, as they watched the sunset from the porch, Margaret leaned her head on his shoulder and whispered, "Your father would be so proud of you." She passed away that night in her sleep, peacefully, surrounded by the scent of blooming tulips. When Ethan found her the next morning, he wept not from guilt this time, but from love. He buried her beside his father under the oak tree in the small town cemetery. And when the final words of the service faded, he stood there for a long time, the wind carrying the soft fragrance of flowers and memories. Afterward, Ethan didn't move back to the city. He stayed in that little Ohio house, keeping it alive with care. He kept fresh flowers by his parents' chairs, left their pictures on the mantel, and each morning brewed 2 cups of coffee, one for himself, one for the memories. On Sundays, he volunteered at the local elderly center, teaching computer skills and helping sons and daughters reconnect with their parents before it was too late. His story spread quietly through the town, a story not about wealth or career, but about forgiveness, redemption, and the power of coming home. Sometimes young people would ask him, "Mr. Dawson, why did you give up everything?" And he'd smile gently and reply, "I didn't give up anything. I just found what matters." On quiet nights, Ethan would sit on the porch where his father once sat, watching the sun dip behind the trees,
painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. He would close his eyes, hearing faint echoes of laughter, the sound of his parents' voices calling
his name, and he would whisper into the breeze, "I'm home, Mom, I'm home, Dad." The wind would rustle through the tulips, as if answering back, and peace would settle deep inside him. For all his years of chasing dreams across cities and towers, he finally understood success meant nothing without someone to share it with. Love was the only wealth that ever grew with time. And so, in that small house at the edge of town, where the walls still held the laughter of the past, Ethan Dawson lived the rest of his life in quiet gratitude. He never remarried, never left, but he filled each day with kindness, helping neighbors, mentoring children, and tending the garden his mother had once loved. And every morning, as the sunlight streamed through the blinds, warming the old wooden floorboards, he smiled softly, whispering to the memories that filled every corner, "Thank you for waiting for me."